In the heart of Africa, a new dawn rises, where the strength of unity and the power of knowledge ignite a transformative journey toward economic empowerment and self-sufficiency. On this beautiful, vast continent, a powerful movement is unfolding. For 15 years, the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, has stood as a beacon of hope, innovation, and collaboration. This documentary takes you on a journey through its remarkable story, one that is woven with the voices and experiences of countless tax officials dedicated to the noble cause of economic empowerment. Through cooperation and shared knowledge, ATAF has transformed the tax landscape across our continent, enabling nations to reclaim their sovereignty and build a prosperous future. Join us as we delve into the lessons learned, the challenges faced, and the victories achieved, guided by the spirit of African unity and resilience. To start off this story, we first hear from Dr. Abubakar Nakanabo about ATAF's significance, achievements, and its role in African tax and governance.
Vous me donnez l'occasion de saluer tous les efforts qui ont été fournis par l'ATAF ces dernières années. Nous pouvons dire que l'ATAF s'est positionnée comme une organisation de référence en Afrique sur les questions de fiscalité. Et aujourd'hui, nous pouvons constater que l'ATAF a beaucoup apporté aux pays africains, que ce soit sur le plan de l'assistance technique qui est offerte gratuitement aux pays africains, également que ce soit sur le plan de renforcement des capacités, mais surtout sur les discussions en cours sur la réforme de la fiscalité internationale, notamment les questions de pilier 1 et pilier 2. L'ATAF a véritablement représenté l'Afrique et a été le porte-voix de l'Afrique pendant les discussions. Et justement, cela a permis à l'Afrique de voir ses préoccupations être prises en compte tenu du fait que l'ATAF connaît bien l'Afrique, connaît les réalités de l'Afrique et bien sûr lutte pour que les administrations fiscales africaines puissent tirer leur épingle du jeu.
The African Tax Administration Forum is built on the dedication and passion of its people, from the bustling offices of the Uganda Revenue Authority to the strategic meetings of the Rwandan Revenue Authority. These tax officials are more than mere bureaucrats. They are champions of change. Through peer-to-peer learning and shared experiences, they strive to overcome challenges and elevate their country's tax systems. Their stories reflect a common commitment to shaping a brighter economic future for Africa. In 2009, Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni launched ATAF at its inaugural conference, calling tax revenue the backbone of African democracy and public service.
I'm still inspired by its transformative and higher purpose to improve the material conditions of our people, especially the poorest and most vulnerable.
The work that I do at ATAF, I don't see ATAF as an employer. I look at my work as a calling. I look at it as an opportunity to be able to help countries collect revenue that can then improve the lives of its citizens. I look at it as an opportunity to help the continent achieve its development agenda. I look at it as an opportunity that can help countries to actually collect taxes that can help us live decent lives in a sustainable way as a global citizen. So for me, I think the work of ATAF is not just you're employed, you come, you work, you get a salary, and that's it. No, you actually take part in the transformation of lives.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought tragic losses across Africa. Yet, African tax officials worked tirelessly to uphold stability. Dr. Philippe Chaudrier, ATAF's chair in 2020, commended ATAF's resilience, noting how its members adapted to virtual operations, emerging even stronger from the crisis. ATAF's story is built on the contributions of thousands of Africans who shaped its foundation, growth, and transformative impact on African tax systems. With a vision to unite the continent, immobilizing resources, strengthening social contracts, and reducing poverty, ATAF became a catalyst for change in African and global taxation. Its roots trace back to the discussions among African tax leaders like Pravin Gordhan and Gershon Passy, who saw the need for an independent forum to address shared tax challenges. In 2007, when Gordhan co-chaired the OECD's Forum on Tax Administration, early collaboration between African and global tax administrations began. From this, the OECD proposed creating an OECD Africa Tax Center, sparking a vision that ultimately led to ATAF.
My contribution to the conversation was the idea of a tax center is excellent, because it will give training, capacity, it will do all the research especially. But I questioned whether it was the right thing to do for an African country or South Africa to establish an African tax center on behalf of a European organization without asking the Africans if they wanted. And so I suggested that why don't we call a meeting of African tax authorities and put this idea to them, because you cannot just establish a resource for the continent and expect them to come if you did not talk to them and see if this is, a demand side thing rather than a supply side thing.
So I first encountered the concept of ATAF was when I was at SARS and responsible for actually international customs at SARS. We had a big customs program for the continent, with regional bodies like SADC, the WCO regional capacity building center, as well as the World Customs Organization at a global level. We wanted to see, could there be something similar for tax on the continent?
In January 2008, African tax officials gathered at an OECD meeting in Cape Town, where a discussion led to plans for a unified African tax initiative. In August, South Africa's Finance Minister, Trevor Manuel, urged leaders from 28 African nations to not waste the crisis, and so the vision for the African Tax Administration Forum, ATAF, was born.
And so at this meeting where about 24 countries attended from Africa and some other guests, we then discussed the idea of a tax center, but we discussed it in the context of the social contract between citizens and the state. We did not simply discuss it in the context of there's tax officials and we need to train them and we need better systems. Yes, those were important. But the underlying theme, the underlying context of what we were discussing those 2-3 days at the Sheraton Hotel in Pretoria was, what is the essence of taxation? And what is the connection between taxation and the value proposition of governments? And therefore, how does that relate to some of the other African peculiarities, such as huge debt, weak debt to GDP ratios, and a whole range of other social, political, and economic issues Africa was facing?
It went through 3 stages. Initially, there was enthusiasm As the discussion began in more depth, there were some concerns, and by the end, because we had addressed those concerns, we regained the enthusiasm, yeah? So it was a bit of a roller coaster ride, yeah?
It would be great if we had a whole African tax administration forum for giving us presence, when we meet at global levels, at international levels, when we go for OECD meetings, and we would have more clout if we were able to sit as equal rather than as small tribes being told what we can and cannot do. Mm-hmm. So it was a brilliant idea. I think it was the end of a successful meeting. So we're all saying, yes, we can. So we all agreed, and those students said, this is a good idea. Let's put a framework to it. We agreed to constitute ourselves into a steering committee towards the launch that would, launch this forum, and then hand over the work to a council.
There was a technical steering committee, and I was asked to convene the technical steering committee. And essentially, I was tasked to set up the organization with a team. Inside SARS, the international department was one of the divisions I was responsible for. And I had two very, very capable senior managers in the team that helped me a lot to conceptualize and do the background work.
It was also at a time when most of us were struggling, because for different reasons, the different countries were being looked at as the main source of revenue for their countries. And the targets that were being set sometimes were extreme. So every head of tax administration's dream was to have a solution as to how they could effectively collect revenue, not just to meet their targets, but to meet the development needs of their countries. And so I was at that meeting. And for me, it was really music to my ears, same as my colleagues.
In my experience in the Southern African Development Community, in the nature of multilateral organizations and in the nature of African organizations, these things are political. When you start a formation, there's often long conversations and battles about who's going to host, who's going to be the chair, who's going to be the executive, who's going to own this thing, who's going to be on the photograph. And long before you've delivered your first value, you start arguing about who's in charge. And my own approach was, this is one thing we must avoid. When you create value, even in the absence of a formation, an organization, and this I learned when I established youth organizations in my young days, when you bring people together, young people, and they have fun, they'll come back. So you don't bring them together and have heavy discussions about Marx and Lenin with them. They're not interested. And so based on some of those principles, I realized that ATAF must be technical.
I mean, I think at that point, one of the factors that was quite significant, Western aid donors still had quite a lot of money to distribute, and there had developed a fairly widespread view or sympathy with the idea that, good tax was not just about raising revenue, but it was about better governance.
Then, of course, South Africa, who are masters at arranging things and organizing things, said, we can offer to play a secretarial role. So they then said, let's put a few documents together. Let's share these documents. Then we'll come back together as the steering committee and actually begin to map out the journey towards the launch of the forum. And also, I think for me, the more important component of leadership was that beyond making these decisions at council, that action was actually being taken. That it was not just, how it is, how you have these meetings and you agree to have another meeting to agree to have another meeting. And in between, things don't really actually change. But in this instance, when decisions were made, then there was the technical teams that would just pick those decisions and action them and then follow up. But I also have to say, honestly, that I think South Africa doesn't get a lot of credit when they should. The secretarial role was huge. It was really big because there was a lot of work. First of all, South Africa, SARS agreed to shoulder, in those early years, shoulder the financial burden, knowing that some of the African countries tend to struggle. When we talked about subscription, not everybody would pay on time. So South Africa shouldered the financial burden for quite a while.
By the time ATAF was launched in Uganda in September 2009, ATAF has already had 11 training programs, attended by 26 countries, attended I think by about 200 and odd people. The OECD was vital here, especially the Global Relations and the Development Committee of the OECD, Ben Dickinson, Richard Perry, because they provided us with the trainers. And so by the time we launched ATAF, we already trained 200 people. And so by the time we launched, it was very difficult because we had to get 10 people on the governing council. But people were not really interested. They were busy. And why would you invest time in another African organization that may or may not survive? Because we do not have a good history of establishing successful organizations on the continent. But with good persuasion, we managed to get countries to serve on the council. And I must say the steering committee, consisting of Mary Baini, who now is the Deputy Executive Secretary of ATAF, Alan Kajina from Uganda, Ifweko Kauru Muigi from Nigeria, the Ghanaian CG, all of them, they played critical roles in getting heads of tax to buy into this. The meeting eventually decided not to establish an OECD tax center, instead to form a tax organization for Africa. And that is how ATAF was born.
From its inception, ATAF has demonstrated agility in the face of evolving challenges. As the organization developed its training and capacity building programs, it adapted to the needs of its member countries. By fostering a culture of innovation, ATAF empowered tax officials with the tools and knowledge required to navigate the complexities of modern tax administration. This dynamic approach has positioned ATAF as a vital player in the global tax landscape, ensuring that Africa's voice is heard and respected.
In that first year, we had two main areas that we concentrated on. One was institutionalizing and building an international organization, the Africa Tax Administration Forum. The second thing was, are the countries in Africa, is this something that they want? So how we did that was we took the program that we were running for SADC with the OECD, and we started to offer it to all countries, all tax administrations on the continent. And through that, the interest of ATAF and the participation, and countries started to see, okay, there's something for taxation on the continent. And by the time we did the launch in November 2009, we had 23 countries that had committed to joining ATAF, signed the agreement, and made a pledge towards it. So by the end of 2009, we were on our road towards taking ATAF and making it an international organization. And at the same time, as an interim secretariat, we had to put together a program that we could deliver to countries. And I think that, if I remember correctly, in 2010, by then, we were continuing with the training, but we were also starting to provide some technical assistance in areas like transfer pricing, in treaty negotiation, so that, Besides the members, the international partners like donors, other international organizations that were watching us and wanting to partner with us could see that, there is this need and there was that support for ATAF.
So in relation to the council decisions that were made that I think were really critical to the growth of the organization, I think one that quickly comes to mind was the decision not just to provide trainings that are offhand, but the decision to come up with a protracted program that would then help the different countries to build internal capacity and to support each other. So we weren't only just going to deliver training and deliver workshops and have conferences. No, we were actually going to go into the actual tax work to look at what the countries needed, to look at it holistically and come up with a solution that would address both the policy and the administrative needs of the countries so that they'd be able to collect revenue and do it effectively and build a tax collection culture on the continent.
And so once we've bought into this, by 2010 we had our first series of meetings, and our meetings remained about training, research and technicality. But we ran it professionally. Good production, good quality, good activities, good events, and our name began to spread through the continent, and countries, even if they were not members, started to come. Because ATAF became a known brand, relatively successful, relatively impactful, and people started to want to be associated with it. So one of the things that we didn't fight was the fact that our leaders tend to more listen to people outside. And we made it work for us. Because when the OECD and the Germans and others started talking about ATAF, then they heard about us. They did not first hear about ATAF from us. They heard about ATAF from others who were giving them development and support. And that was an important part of the methodology.
The OECD, which was the body where the international tax stuff took place, and ATAF have worked very closely together. But you have this interesting thing of the OECD trying to become global, so getting more and more countries at the time where Africa was building itself, its own capacities in tax. So you have a parallel there, and one fed the other, and reciprocally probably, because the growing of the agenda at the OECD gave material for ATAF to have a grip and to develop its own thing, even though ATAF was much broader than just contributing to the international tax agenda, and vice versa. The ATAF existence was a way to feed African views into the global forum first, and then the inclusive framework.
ATAF's early strength lay in leadership skills at framing tax as an essential for effective and democratic states. Positioned in a complex international landscape, ATAF championed top development issues, quickly establishing credibility with members and partners. Lincoln, leading the interim secretariat's capacity building, noted the goal to show immediate impact through technical assistance, African-focused standards, and practical solutions. Early training, supported by SARS and OECD experts, emphasized mutual support over taking stances, earning ATAF a reputation for under-promising and over-delivering. By 2011, ATAF recognized the need to tailor its training directly to African countries' experiences. The 2008 financial crisis spurred ATAF's fruition, and its small team quickly emerged as an influential African voice in global tax reform. As the OECD launched its BEPS initiative to counter tax avoidance, ATAF emphasized addressing Africa's unique challenges, such as transfer pricing and extractive industry contracts. This approach led to the formation of the Cross-Border Taxation Committee, which adapted global reforms for African needs. ATAF's agility and partnership with African tax administrations made it uniquely effective. It supported African countries in combating illicit financial flows, assessing over $4 billion in additional taxes by strengthening audit capacity and tightening legislation.
A report is published by an NGO called Action Aid, calling time. And it's a report that tells the story of Ghana Breweries. And Ghana Breweries was the most profitable brewery for SAB Miller for 5 years up to 2011. But in that 5 years, they did not pay a cent in tax to Ghana. And the organization published this. And I happened to meet the author of the report. We called a meeting of our executive and some experts in South African Revenue Service. One particular expert, a guy called Ron van der Merwe, brilliant international tax guy. And Ron explains how this works. And without going into much of the detail, but in the way that the tax treaty between Ghana, the Netherlands, Ireland, and Mauritius worked. So Ghana had tax treaties, double taxation treaties with Mauritius. It had a double taxation treaty with Ireland, with the Netherlands. Because of those treaties, according to this report, the company could use the provisions of articles in that treaties to the extent that they did not have to pay any tax. Because they registered a procurement company in Mauritius, they registered an HR company in Ireland, and they registered the IP in the Netherlands. And so after profit, they paid those companies. So there was no profit left, nothing to tax. That's the simple explanation. And then we had this conversation about this is tax avoidance. There must be something we can do. And Ron explained you need a treaty, a multilateral treaty, and you need to change some of the laws. And that set ATAF onto a path of legislative and policy intervention, 2011. And then I knew that that is the path. The path is not just giving training. The path is enabling legislative environment, fixing the policy environment, and designing the policy around the conditions of the African continent, because our economies are driven by extractive industry. Our economy is driven by high informality. Our economy is driven by subsistence and commercial agriculture, and some parts of manufacturing that was not yet taken to the east. And so the type of tax policy and tax legislative environment could not just be taken from an OECD model. We had to design African models. We immediately came up with what is called the African Agreement of Mutual Assistance in Tax Administration. It's called the AMATAM. And we called together our member countries, and 26 African countries over a period of 2 years negotiated a multilateral African agreement, basically a kind of a model tax treaty, and an agreement that allows countries to exchange information. Because what we needed in the case of Ghana, if we were able to send auditors, if we were able to have access to the information, we could have helped Ghana deal with not getting tax. But we couldn't, because tax, you cannot share taxpayer information. But when you have a multilateral instrument that you've agreed to and signed, it legally allows you to share taxpayer information. And so ATAF in 2011 had to move into kind of adult space, even though we were still a kid. And that is when I knew that if we can get value out of treaties, out of exchange of information, and out of sharing auditors between countries, this is the path of Africans helping each other. This is the broader context of South-South cooperation. And in discussions with those who supported us, our donors, South Africa, even the OECD, the idea of a South-South cooperation-powered engine was very significant.
ATAF's decentralized model empowered member countries to lead initiatives like the VAT Committee, which tackled VAT compliance in challenging sectors, and the Exchange of Information Committee, which aided audits on multinationals. ATAF's cycle of capacity building and peer-to-peer knowledge sharing gave it a competitive edge, blending responsiveness with deep local expertise. By 2014, ATAF expanded its impact, launching the Africa Tax Research Network, an executive master's in taxation, and the African Tax Outlook to foster expertise and peer collaboration across the continent. ATAF's flexibility and inclusivity have proven essential, enabling it to steer through shifting global tax landscapes and sustain long-term impact for its members. This resilience gives ATAF the wings to keep advancing Africa's tax agenda.
When we started, we were looking at the capacities of countries and how, each country would get to the next level where it's able to collect revenue effectively, build capacity within the country. But most importantly, maybe if I would use, say, the audit function, try and build a critical mass of people who would be able to carry out that work, because there was also an issue of the quick turnaround of the tax officers.
The driver at the very beginning, if you recall, was domestic resource mobilization, us being able to mobilize and support one another. And beyond that was, I think that the discussion was, do we even have the capacity? So capacity development, building the capacities of tax administrations to mobilize revenue.
The real issues that face Africa, they're not international, they're domestic, yeah? I mean, obviously, the international is the dog, is the tail of the dog itself is domestic, yeah? So the really big issues are VAT, it's property taxes, it's domestic compliance, it's the way you tax capital and income, it's the lack of, that most countries have personal income taxes, including South Africa, which are still pretty marginal, yeah?
The issue of financial support and financial sustainability is incredibly difficult to manage. At an ideological level, you would want to be as financially independent as possible to ensure independent thinking, to ensure your agenda is your own, and to ensure that you are free to do the things that you can do for your members without serving the political or economic interest of those who fund you. Some of the principles that drove us has been, whether it's getting membership fees, whether it's getting the host country, South Africa, who is the biggest African contributor to the organization, or whether it's the donors, we always understood that we have to be a high-performing, successful organization because everybody wants to associate with success. And one of the things that we jealously guarded in the way that we managed our finances in order to do the right thing and to give confidence to those who support us is we have always kept our non-operational expenses, the cost of running the organization, we've always kept it at around 30%. So 30 cents in a dollar. In my limited understanding, that is below the average. Because in general, funded organizations spend between 50 and 70% of what they get on administration, salaries. And that's really important, so that you spend the money on member value, member activities, and on the business of the organization.
The OECD was an early partner to get it off the ground and has continued over the 15 years to be a key supporter of ATAF. And they did this in a number of ways. In the early days, it was providing the training to ATAF, for us to be able to deliver this on the continent. But they also provided us with access to donors through the Development Assistance Committee at the OECD. We also, through the Task Force on Tax and Development, then started to also engage with a number of donors as well, and other organizations like the World Bank that also, showed an interest in partnering with with ATAF.
South Africa's continued support as host country, along with diversified funding from early partners, has been essential to ATAF's growth. To ensure sustainability, ATAF explores options like increased member fees and partnerships with African institutions such as the African Union. However, balancing funding sources is crucial to maintain accessibility for all member countries, especially the poorest. ATAF has strengthened Africa's role in global tax reform, influencing rules on BEPS, digitalization, and transparency. Founded with a developmental mission, ATAF's partnerships with organizations like the OECD have elevated African voices internationally.
The higher purpose we serve is the impact our work has on the lives of every citizen, especially the most vulnerable among us. Today, we can proudly say that ATAF is an institution built by Africans for Africans. We enjoy the political support of the African Union and is recognized by multilateral institutions around the globe as a credible voice on behalf of African tax administrations in the global tax policy matters. What better reason can there be to support and build on the success of ATAF? When ATAF was first conceptualized around 2008, it was based on the simple premise that a tax risk anywhere is a tax risk everywhere. And if we want to improve our capacity and capability in tax administration and revenue collection, we must collaborate as leaders of African tax administrations. The sharing of best practices, learning together, and building the enabling capacity of people, technology, and data was at the core of the ATAF mandate.
One of the issues that later came to mind was you cannot tax if you don't have the actual rights to tax. And so that required ATAF also to get involved in, and speak as Africa's voice. And we put on the table what decisions and what examples and what areas we wanted the world to focus on that would then come up with decisions that were fit and rules that were fit for purpose for Africa.
ATAF and many African countries started participating in base erosion and profit shifting project phase 1. Was it a good idea to participate? It is a good idea for African countries to make sure that they remain engaged in the global debate on setting tax and rules, because those international rules, they impact countries in Africa. They impact them because we have, of course, cross-border transaction, and the cross-border transaction will manifest themselves either in the digital economy or in the traditional businesses where you got a member of the group operating in one African country and a parent maybe in a European country, and they are transacting. So you got some transactions there. And therefore, how we tax those kind of structures, we need to apply global rules.
The CBT committee had a massive impact on formulating African standards that ultimately went through to the OECD and the United Nations. A group of individuals and experts from African countries played a critical role in ensuring that a technical solution is formulated and one that ATAF can use as the voice of Africa. Core to the problem identified by the CBT were issues such as transfer pricing, permanent establishments, and interest deductibility. The CBT worked with various members of the Secretariat to develop toolkits and products that are ultimately in providing solutions for these identified problems.
ATAF saw an opportunity to bring together African countries, particularly those that already expressed interest to be part of the conversation even at that point. And so we found an opportunity that was important, particularly on some of the pending work.
During the base erosion and profit shifting project initiated by the OECD, large economies such as the United States of America were persuaded by technical arguments formulated by ATAF. Specifically, when you look at action points 8 to 10, focused on transfer pricing, our teams were able to formulate positions that were strong technically to be accepted by the participating members of the OECD.
And one of the key work which was being done under transfer pricing was revision of certain methods. One method which wanted to be revised was a method called comparable and controlled price method, which is how to use quoted prices in context of commodities, and ATAF engaged in that conversation quite extensively.
During BEPS 1.0, ATAF unified African countries into a strong technical committee to address shared tax policy interests, establishing a collaborative approach that became its hallmark. In the BEPS 2.0 phase, focused on digitalization, developing countries faced challenges in taxing digital businesses without a physical presence. ATAF's proactive role continues to help address these complexities.
The world has changed. We're in the digital era, and so what we have seen is the very new business models that help a certain class of multinationals and even now small enterprises to participate virtually in many parts of the world, in many jurisdictions, without necessarily creating physical presence. And when businesses such as those, and we call them highly digitalized businesses, don't create that sufficient physical presence, then we create a gap in taxation. Perhaps the conversation at the UN may come up even with more rules, and if those, of course, come up and they are more implementable, give more rights, then also countries can embrace those.
I recall when we had some of those discussions, especially at the OECD, and ATAF was actually, I think, the only regional tax organization that did present a proposal. So, there was a two-pillar solution that was being suggested, and ATAF came up with a proposal on how one of the pillars could be drafted. At the time, everybody was shocked that, we had come up with this proposal. But in the end, a couple of the proposals of the decisions that we were putting across were adopted, and the continent gained that much.
You have shaped Pillar 1, Amount A. You have shaped some elements of Pillar 2 by doing your job, which was to explain what was going on to African countries, by understanding the African perspective when there was such a thing as an African perspective, but there was, and by being able to sit at the table with the US, with the Indians and the others, and tell these countries, well, sorry, but this is our view. So one which was to stand against or to stand up to rich countries and say, sorry, but this is our view. Another one, which is very interesting too, which was to stand to India and say, well, you're pretending to speak on behalf of developing countries, but actually you are very different from us, and this is what our view is, and this is what our position is.
Through ATAF's expertise, African countries have gained influence in global tax reform, asserting that tax rule negotiations should be inclusive. ATAF has kept African priorities central, promoting constructive engagement at the OECD and UN. In 2024, ATAF backed terms for a UN framework to address issues like digital taxation and illicit financial flows. As an observer, ATAF supports African nations with technical guidance, tools, and strategies for impactful participation in global tax policy, helping shape solutions to Africa's tax challenges.
African Union now being part of the G20 presents both opportunities and in number of ways also challenges. The opportunity is that we have now an opportunity for African Union being at the table to set the agenda that reflects the realities of the continent, the agenda that captures the voices of the continent, and that is going to be critical.
The fundamental principles, certainly of the African tax agenda and specifically of ATAF, is the allocation of taxing rights to source jurisdictions. This simply means the allocation of profits to where activities take place. Many of these activities take place on the African continent but are not taxed in Africa. And so as a fundamental principle of the work we've done is to allocate profits to the jurisdictions in Africa.
We have been approached by different tax administration. For instance, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been offering support to the French-speaking countries in revenue forecasting based on the expertise and the knowledge we also received from SARS. Particularly Togo, we have had a long relationship, and again, this has been facilitated through ATAF. Our team has been, our staff have been supporting the Togo Revenue Authority in building similar capacity. But also we've had a group where we've had working relations with the Francophone group, where we set up, where we had workshops to provide them with similar support. This has been, they organized them as a group, and then again this was facilitated by ATAF. As SARS was helping the Anglophone countries, Rwanda Revenue Authority was facilitating the Francophone countries. So yes, we remain available and ready to support others by sharing the same, of course, through the ATAF arrangement, and because we've seen the benefits, and we look forward to having similar support going forward.
Global tax rulemaking may be shifting from BEPS 2.0 to the UN, where developing country-focused reform is gaining traction. While the UN's authority is strong, its capacity to implement change will rely on member commitment and expanded resources. ATAF has proven its value by highlighting tax issues, proposing practical solutions for Africa, and effectively negotiating on the international stage.
One risk that ATAF faces is that many countries view it as the go-to organization in resolving all of its tax challenges. Certainly, there are partners that we work with who assist in formulating positions and assistance in countries, and this should always be maintained. The second element is that the work we do in standard setting draws us more and more into bureaucratic positions of those multilateral organizations. ATAF, being a quick and agile organization, runs the risk of being drawn in to the third element, which are global tax wars. The role of ATAF is not to participate in tax wars, but rather to support African countries in their efforts to mobilize domestic resources.
I think our growth as an organization and our growth as a brand and the impact we have had both as a voice of Africa in global matters and in the revenue generation success has made the regional organizations take note of the contribution as an African organization we can make. And in this regard, I'm very happy that after a long period of discussions, ATAF now is an integral part of the tax program of the African Union Commission. So ATAF is now the technical advisors to the African Union Commission Specialized Technical Committee for Ministers dealing with finance and economics.
And within the country-specific support, We provide this support to countries by guiding them around legal frameworks, whether it's a review of the policy, legislation, and administrative processes. And through this, in the last 15 years, we've been able to help about 38 countries, and we've had about 55 legislative reforms. And in all, through these legislative reforms and direct audit support, we've also been able to help countries have a total of $2.1 billion in revenue collection. Why is this important? It's important, like I mentioned, because it supports, again, financing for the SDGs and the Africa we want. And part of this program is also looking at the tax-related IFFs, the illicit financial flows on the continent, and combining that conversation with the DRM conversation to understand how that affects our ability to mobilize revenue on the continent. Making sure we block the loopholes, we improve the administrative processes, but more importantly, we have an evidence-based tax policy system. And also, when we look at administration, that we're able to learn from our environment, to have peer learning around what works within the context of the continent.
The World Bank has been a very, very good partner with us. The World Bank works on the continent with us. We lead some projects, they lead some projects. They never try to take center stage. They allow themselves to work on technical programs and tax reform programs and take in guidance from the African experts that we provide who knows African conditions, and our cooperation with the World Bank has been incredibly successful. Our work with the African Union is the key driver of where we're going for the next 10 years, and then our engagement with the African Development Bank as our key strategic partner, not only as a potential funder of our activities, but as a partner for African tax reform, as an implementer for their programs of African public finance reform, the taxation aspect of it. So that's very important.
First time I met Logan, you ask, what's your background? You're an economist, you're a lawyer, and he said, my background is jail.
Absolutely.
And of course, it completely changes the dynamic. So it's about, people like you and Logan at the beginning in terms of showing independence and authority. That's big.
It was a small secretariat. But if you looked at the work that the secretariat did, it was way beyond anybody's expectations. So straight away, it came to, my mind that the only way it could have worked is that ATAF had great leadership. It had focused leadership that was able to get to use the minimal number of staff, the minimal means, the minimal resources, creative ways like using experts from tax administrations to try and support the countries over the years. So for me, I think the critical thing to note there is the excellent leadership that has driven the work of ATAF over the years.
Having a leadership that is mature, that is not short-sighted in terms of ownership, being political, because when things are successful and when things produces results, people tend to want to own it. And then you begin to have politics enter this. Who does what? Where is the meeting held? Why don't we have offices? Why can't I have the head office? Why can't the leadership come from my country? Those issues can still enter into our organizations. We're not immune to it.
I also must say that the thing that gave me great pleasure was establishing the ATAF Women in Tax Network and to bring women across the continent together. And that was, having worked in the different forums and in organizations, we wanted to create something that was really different, that brought women not just in tax administrations together, but women in the private sector, academia, etc. And The ATAF Women in Tax was established in 2021 and is now just 3 years, going on to 4 years soon. And I think it already can tell a story. So that was something that was important.
ATAF's vision for transforming Africa's tax landscape goes beyond adopting global frameworks. It empowers African countries to set their own tax agenda. This transformation relies on passionate tax officials, advanced technologies, and project-driven work ethic. ATAF's Tax Academy plays a vital role fostering knowledge sharing and professional development among tax officials, creating networks that enhance skills and retention. Recent training initiatives emphasize peer learning and capacity building, enabling tax agencies to elevate staff expertise and professionalism. The Academy, as a knowledge hub with resources like the African Tax Research Network, aims to support African-led tax innovations, with member needs guiding its mission. The 8th AQRN conference in Tanzania in 2023 marked a pivotal moment for African tax leadership, emphasizing the need to set our own agenda. The event launched the 3rd volume of the African Multidisciplinary Tax Journal with AQRN board chair Professor Annette Ogutun, highlighting that tax research is essential for addressing Africa's social-economic challenges. Building networks has been central to ATAF's impact, uniting members to speak with one voice. 2 key initiatives embody this: the ATAF country correspondents and the heads of tax administration masterclass. Country correspondents maintain vital links between member countries and the Secretariat, sharing trends, solutions, and insights on tailored programs. In 2024, country correspondents emphasized priorities like data development, leadership training, and accession to the Agreement on Mutual Assistance in Tax Matters, enhancing cooperation in tax matters across Africa. The Masterclass for Commissioners General offers a unique space for leaders to exchange best practices. These sessions foster collaboration, making ATAF's leaders a close-knit network ready to drive impactful tax policies across the continent.
The secret to its success to date has been that ATAF listens to member countries, understands the requirements and needs of members, and provides programs aligned to these requirements and to the needs of members. Therefore, ATAF's future success will equally be 1. To retain its strong member orientation and involvement. 2. To lead with a clear vision and strategic intent, mindful of its transformative impact on people. 3. To continually evolve and respond to the changing geopolitical context, as well as financial and tax landscape due to the impact of data and technology.
I see ATAF in 2030 having achieved some of what we had set out in the new decade, but also looking at what can we do better, how do we get to meeting the Agenda 2063, and also looking at building better solutions for the continent, and ensuring that when you're talking at a public forum in the future, I want to be only quoting ATAF products. I want to be able to say, this is what ATAF has done in the following countries. This is the data that we have to show what ATAF has been able to achieve.
Another area that I think of that maybe we should have done would have been to prepare better in terms of the services that we provide to the different linguistic needs of our membership. And much as we have tried to grow in that area, we are still not there yet. But it is a priority now in the new decade, and I think we will get it right. And of course, the fact that we have been working, providing our services while looking at Africa, as a continent. I think as we go forward, Maybe what we could have looked at was the issue of how we could devolve some of our services to the regions, to some of the regional economic communities. But again, that is an issue, or that is an area that will be addressed in the new decade.
As we reflect on the story of the African Tax Administration Forum, we recognize that its achievements are not just measured in revenue collected, but in the lives improved and futures secured. By fostering collaboration, innovation, and leadership, ATAF has paved the way for a prosperous Africa, where tax systems serve as the backbone of sustainable development. Together, we stand at the brink of a new era, one where African nations shape their destinies through empowered tax administration and mutual support. Let us continue this journey towards a future defined by unity, strength, and shared success.